Why the working class voted to leave the EU and why the Remainers still don't get it. When trying to understand why certain demographics voted to leave the EU while other demographics voted to remain, it's much easier to understand why people voted the way they did if you look through the prism of upside potential versus downside risk. The simple fact is that working class people had a greater upside opportunity from leaving the European Union, where middle class and especially higher earners, the downside risk of leaving the European Union was much higher than the upside. Let's take a look at the data that supports this view. This chart is from Lord Ashcroft Polls. It shows the various ways different demographics voted in the EU referendum. It covers the males versus females, different age demographics, but what we're interested in are the last four bars, which is A, B, C1, C2 and DE. This is essentially social levels, AB being highly skilled professional workers, C1 being a bit more in the middle, C2 and DE being the lower working class people. So this shows a good spread of how the different demographics, especially the class differences in the UK, voted. Social grade is a classification system based on occupation. It was developed for use on the National Readership Survey, and for over 50 years the NRS has been the research industry's source of social grade data. The top table on your screen is from the National Readership Survey website, and it shows the percentage of the population that fall into the different social grade groups. The bottom chart is from the Lord Ashcroft Polls website, and it shows how these different social grade groups voted in the EU referendum. As you can see, AB, Group AB, this is middle class, this is people with good professional jobs. Group AB are the only class group that voted in favour of remaining in the European Union. They voted 57% in favour of remaining in the EU versus 43% that voted to leave. So Group AB, this is higher managerial and also intermediate managerial, administrative and professional jobs. The other social grade groups we have is C1, which is supervisory, clerical and junior managerial, had a slight bias in favour of leave, but not by much. It was basically 51% leave versus 49% remain. But when you look at the lower end of the spectrum, this is core working class demographics. We see a big shift in the fact that working class people had a bigger shift to vote in for leaving the European Union. This is 64% in category C2, which is skilled manual workers, and then again 64% in the even lower tiers than that, which is semi-skilled and unskilled manual workers, state pensioners, casual and lowest grade workers, unemployed and state benefits only. So you can see as you get to the nearer the bottom of the pile, the shift is away from the European Union, and this is because the downside risk, the nearer you are to the bottom of the pile, if you're unemployed or on a minimum wage job, you'll get nearer to the bottom of the pile. So the downside risk of leaving the European Union is low, the upside potential is greater. The problems facing working class people are no big secret. Since the large influx of Eastern European workers in 2004, we've seen many working class people saying they're struggling to find jobs, they are struggling to find housing, wages are being suppressed. You don't need a degree in economics to understand if there's a large pool of workers, and most workers coming from Europe and indeed overseas, they tend to be lower skilled workers. So this is direct competition to the average working person. We're seeing wage suppression. This is affecting the pay packet. There's large pressure on schools, on housing, on the NHS. These are all factors that directly affect working class people. So it should be no surprise to anybody why the working class specifically have voted for Brexit. Their downside risk is very low. You're looking at people that may already be unemployed, or if they are working, they're probably on a near minimum wage job. So how much lower can their working conditions, how much lower can their living standards be? Because they're already near the bottom of the pile. If you're on a minimum wage job, how much lower can your pay actually be? If you're only unemployed, you're pretty much at the bottom anyway. Compare that to the average middle class person, someone with a good professional job. Their downside risk is huge. If you're on a 80, £100,000 a year job, your downside risk is huge, because you could potentially lose £100,000 a year, right? You're going from 100, maybe 120 grand a year job down to zero. So that's a huge downside potential. The average working person has nowhere near that amount to lose. If you're middle class, you probably live in a quote unquote nicer area, an area that's probably much less affected by mass migration. Schools in your area are probably still relatively, not being massively oversubscribed as we see in inner urban areas. Your NHS services are probably have nowhere near the pressure that they do in working class areas. So the reason that the working class has overwhelmingly voted to leave the European Union is all down to upside versus downside risk. The average working class person can see the upside potential from the UK leaving the European Union, lower immigration, lower strains on schools, on services. Whether that happens, whether the politicians will deliver that, that's another thing that remains to be seen. But you can understand why working class people were driven towards Brexit, and you must also understand why middle class people are overwhelmingly pro-Remain, because if you're on a salary that's 4 or 5 times the national average, your downside risk is massive, because if you're worried obviously about loss of jobs, loss of earnings, because you've probably got a nice big house, you've probably got a nice car, you've probably got a wife that's going to leave you if you lose your job, right? So the downside risk for a middle class person is huge. Upside potential for a working class person is quite promising. So this is why the working class people voted to leave. It's just amazing that the Remainers haven't caught on to this. This is why they're continuing to lose the battle. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on this one. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why are the working class overwhelmingly pro-leave, and why the middle classes want to protect their 120 grand a year jobs? It's self-explanatory in my opinion. Jason from Liberty Bunkers signing off, and I'll see you in the next video.